Good morning. Thank you, everybody, so much for taking the time to come and see this talk. And obviously, thank you so much to Cybertech for having me and for the invitation. My name is Ric. I'm a security researcher at Orange Cyberdefense, and I kind of describe what I do as finding out cool things and then telling people about them. So hopefully this is a cool thing that I'm going to be telling you about today. This talk is on the back of some research that was part of a larger research team from a few years ago from Lancaster University. And one of those researchers was Marina Crotefil from yesterday's keynote. She told me I had to say that. And it's actually where I met Marina, so my life hasn't been the same since. Read from that what you will. This talk is predominantly, click, please.
Use my magic power. We need help.
What? Is that working? Okay, cool. So yeah, this talk is predominantly made for an IT audience. So does anyone need me to say that, to tell you about this? Anyone at all? No? Okay, cool. Let's get talking about the cyber. This is probably going to be quite controversial considering the demos that are here, but most OT cyber attack demos are completely science fiction. And they're not here. But in IT-focused events or very marketing-focused demos, they very much are science fiction. And I'm sure everybody here knows the type of demo that I'm talking about, where the adversary just has some crazy knowledge of the entire process and somehow manages to absolutely wreck everything and somehow knows exactly what to do to really optimize this damage. And the problem with that is the expected knowledge that the adversary has in that situation is far too high. It's infeasibly high. Attacks like that really require a lot of preparation, financial investment, time investment. And either that or the adversary's technical capability is extremely high, or they have some sort of supernatural understanding of the physical process that they're attacking. And the pictures on the slide are from demos that I've been involved with, so I am guilty of at least doing this to a little extent as well. So I am one of those people, so sorry about that. But yeah, you're saying, Ric, there have been certain attacks that have been extremely sophisticated. We were at an OT ICS conference, we have to mention Stuxnet at some point, right? But it's really well understood that attacks like that take a monumental amount of effort. And that's even for state-sponsored adversaries. Those kind of attacks really often require leveraging human intelligence organizations as well as cyber attack capabilities. And they're very costly. And actually, we did a study on this last year at Orange Cyberdefense. And what we found, this is a kind of weirdly complicated diagram, but we looked at cyber attacks between 1988 and 2023 that impacted operational technology environments. This was as many as we could find with actually rich data that we could rely on. And what we found is that sophisticated attacks are actually really quite rare. If you look here, 2B, at the very bottom, OT-targeted sophisticated attacks, they're a really small portion of the overall attacks across those 35 years. So they're really quite rare, they're really difficult to pull off, and what we actually see is a lot of IT-targeted cyber attacks. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to really do those sophisticated attacks a little bit easier. But the reason, let's continue with why it's difficult. The reason it's difficult is using traditional IT reconnaissance and enumeration techniques in an OT environment are really difficult. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, so apologies if I am. But slamming things like vulnerability scanners or Mmap or anything around an OT environment is really dangerous, and it can cause unexpected or unwanted behavior, taking things offline and that kind of thing. And also, it's really quite difficult using those kind of IT tools to actually understand what's going on in the physical process as well. I like to use the analogy, if I use Mmap, for example, on a web server, I can see port 80 and 443, for example. And I know that there's a web server there, but I need some specialist tools to actually know what the web server is doing. And that's very similar in an OT situation. I may see port 102 or port 502 open or something like that, and I know that that may be a PLC, but I don't know what it's doing. So from an adversary's perspective, if they don't know what these kind of PLCs are doing, they can't precisely manipulate it in some sort of sophisticated attack because they can't understand it yet. So to put that really simply, sorry, I kind of glossed over it. Everyone is familiar, I hope, with the Purdue model. I know it's not exactly the most, the best representation, and people are kind of starting to not like it nowadays, but it's still kind of handy for a conversation piece. So for an IT cyber attack in the enterprise zone, we have talkative, resilient assets that will really easily facilitate these sophisticated attacks. And then down in the OT, we have fragile assets that will typically fall over under the most basic of reconnaissance, and they will prevent the propagation of sophisticated attacks, just naturally because they don't really want to facilitate it. And even if you can start to understand it, you start exfiltrating piping and instrumentation diagrams, you start seeing mimics on HMIs and start understanding what's going on. Getting from that stage to actually writing some sort of actual, like, sophisticated, meaningful and impactful attack is extremely challenging still. Don't worry, that code is just complete nonsense. It was just kind of like just for representation. So that does look a bit silly, so don't worry, that isn't actual code. So what do these demos that I was talking about at the start, and what do sophisticated cyber attacks require? What do the demos not consider? And that's process comprehension, which is essentially an additional tactic in the cyber-physical attack lifecycle. And what process comprehension involves is building an understanding of what's actually happening in the physical process, and building an understanding of how the operational technology is interacting with the physical world, and how that's all put together. Now, this is an absolute requirement to do any meaningful, sophisticated attack in operational technology. So we're not talking about nuisance attacks. We're not talking about sending PLC stop requests from Metasploit. We're not talking about brute forcing HMI login pages and starting messing around with functionality there. We're not interested in those low precision, low hanging fruit attacks for this talk. We're talking about things that are really complex, meaningful attacks. The one problem with that, however, is if we've breached an OT environment over the internet, we don't have a human intelligence agency to hand to help us physically get access. It's actually really challenging because typically process comprehension involves physical infiltration of the environment. It involves extracting physical information as well. Also, that HMI is from a really cool environment, so come ask me at the end where it's from. I don't really want to say out loud, but they're kind of cool with the picture, but they're probably not cool with me mentioning where it's from. So, process comprehension typically requires physical infiltration, but if us as cyber attackers can't get physically to the environment because we can't leverage a human intelligence agency, we have to do process comprehension at a distance. So this is where the research started. We had some criteria that we wanted to achieve in order to actually be able to do this. The first is we want to be able to extract elements of what the OT is actually doing within the physical process, and therefore what the PLC code is actually doing to facilitate interactions with the physical assets, so how everything is put together. We obviously need to be able to do that over the network because that's how we actually got our foothold. And preferably, we'd like to be able to do that in a stealthy manner because if we're doing something sophisticated, we probably want to maintain persistence for a reasonable amount of time. We don't want to do something overt, immediately get caught, and then get booted out. Now, on the bottom right of the slide, there is some tactful foreshadowing. The terminology and the pictures and everything that I'm going to use throughout this talk from the Siemens ecosystem, for the most part. However, this is systemic to multiple vendors. And we did follow responsible disclosure, and one of the last slides, I'll talk about the responsible disclosure process and why I'm being a little bit ambiguous about the devices that this affects. So I might be talking about some really simple things for certain engineers here. So I'm going to be talking about a few PLC programming practices that were necessary to understand for us to actually build the research. Again, this is typically made for an IT audience, so this might be too obvious for people here, so apologies. Typically, we will have functions which kind of do simple tasks, and it doesn't have their own memory. They'll use the global variable block, and I'll talk about what variable block is in terms of our terminology for generalization in a minute. Then there's function blocks, which do have their own memory, which we'll call local variable blocks. And then those variable blocks themselves, they essentially store input, output, internal variables, and things like that required for the programs to run. These can be global, which is basically something that everything can use and can share, and larger variables are stored there as well. And they can be local, specific to function blocks. And this variable block term is unofficial, but because this affected multiple vendors, we kind of wanted to generalize a little bit. So in Siemens, it might be data block, in Allen Bradley, it might be data file. But the kind of architecture is quite similar through various ecosystems. So one of the problems with PLC programming practices is just the library function blocks that you use. Typically dragging and dropping these very standardized codes in, which are very often proprietary, is really problematic. You can't view the actual underlying code, and you definitely cannot edit it. So if there are any vulnerabilities, either with the code itself or the underlying memory, there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to use it, which is extremely problematic going forward. Now, the function blocks are really what we want to understand to be able to start building process comprehension. That's kind of the main code that we want to understand is how it's facilitating between the interactions between the OT and the physical assets. Unfortunately, there isn't really a covert way, which was one of our criteria to be stealthy, of accessing what function blocks are actually running on a PLC over the network without doing things like actually extracting the code using the configuration software, which is not covert whatsoever. However, as I said, the function blocks all typically have a local variable block, which is a specific piece of memory. And what's interesting is, because of this, devices on the OT network, HMIs, things like that, typically need access to variables on the PLC, and typically will access local variable blocks and global variable blocks on the PLC, and that's just legitimate traffic across the network. And we can abuse that legitimate traffic for our access. So what we can actually do is begin to look at how we can enumerate the function blocks running on a PLC by targeting the local variable blocks that are associated with those function blocks. There are a couple of methods that we looked at originally that are kind of just within libraries and things like that. So the first is get block info, and it actually pulls out some really interesting metadata, and it looks great, formats it lovely, tells us exactly what's running, the size of the memory and everything. As well as the block upload function, which downloads the block information in a bulk transfer. And it looks kind of ugly, but we can still pull out some things, and we can parse it, and we can understand what's going on. The only problem is, while we can identify which function blocks are actually running because of that, they're extremely noisy on the network. These aren't commands that are typically seen. So any rudimentary monitoring software is going to immediately pick that up and start shouting about it. However, we can also perform bytecode read requests over the network as well. And this is something that is frequently seen over the network. It's how the devices typically talk to one another in their own native language, essentially. So any malicious traffic that we do using these bytecode read requests looks just like legitimate traffic. It's extremely stealthy, and it's very difficult to differentiate between the legitimate traffic and the malicious traffic. In fact, using this, we can actually already narrow down which function blocks are running on the PLC and which ones we're looking at, because when we start doing this and we start extracting the bytes, certain local variable blocks will have very specific lengths that are already unique. However, that's only a very small subset, so we do need to keep going further to create some sort of certainty in our signaturing. So then we start looking at how the actual memory is structured and what we're pulling out. And what we see is that when these function blocks, these library function blocks, are instantiated, the memory that is instantiated with them is extremely standardized in a very inefficient way. So what we're seeing is, on the screenshot at the very top of the slide, is from TIA portal, and it's the local variable block for a function block that we just pulled out. And the first variable is a Boolean. And it takes 2 bytes for what essentially requires 1 bit. And what's interesting there is that second byte is always unused. It's always just zeros, 8 zeros. So when we actually start looking through the memory, we can see that these zeros happen quite often. In fact, within the first 30 bytes of the function block that we pulled out almost arbitrarily, there are 3 full bytes. And this is about 300 bytes long. So we start to see patterns that when we combine with the actual bytecode length of the local variable block that we're looking at, we can actually start to find that there are almost always unique signatures between the bytecode length of the local variable block and where these 0-byte offsets are. So what we can then do is essentially we basically go through and we find the length of every byte that we pulled out. So we find the number of bytes that we pulled out. And then we go, okay, so where are the zeros? Are they where we expect them to be? And if we have a match, we essentially already know what library function block we're looking at. So to do this, we just have a very simple process where we first check the length, we read all of the local variable block, and we see how many bytes that we pulled out. If there's a unique match on length then, great, we've already found the specific library function block that we're looking at. However, if there's a collision and there are multiple library function blocks that have the same local variable block length, then we need to check where the 0 bytes are. At that point, we can pretty much guarantee that we're going to identify which one we're looking at because we'll know exactly where the 0 bytes are in memory. Finally, we can do that for every library function block that's running on the PLC, and we can basically enumerate every function block that's there. There are limitations to this, of course. If we haven't seen a specific library function block, or it's a custom function block that's written specifically for the process that we're looking at, then we're not going to get a match. But those kind of things we can kind of engineer to be essentially infrequent as we need them to be. But what's really interesting is we're pulling every single byte out. So we know the entirety of the memory in its binary form. And we know which library function block we're looking at. So we can then actually identify exactly where all the variables actually lie in that memory. Which means we can then precisely identify exactly what the values are for every variable in memory. So for a very quick example, the screenshot on the left-hand side just shows the baud rate of 9600, and that's an offset byte 4. And on the screenshot on the right-hand side is the memory that we've pulled out. And if you look byte 4 through to byte 7, that binary equates to 9600. So we exactly know what is in memory and what the variable says. So we also have large variables, and I mentioned it before with the global variable block, that large variables are stored there. For example, credentials in memory will have, rather than being stored in the local variable block, they will point to a specific place in the global variable block. And rather than that being a problem, we can literally just decode where that pointer points to, and then go and read that from the global variable block instead. So that means that we can actually start extracting things like credentials and fun stuff like that. Not only can we read, we can also write. So there are a few different types of variables, and I'm not going to preach to the choir because I think this is something that most people here will understand. I'll go over very quickly. Default variables, things that haven't really been assigned, are easy to permanently overwrite. So they are our variables at this point. Then direct variables, indirect variables, and pointers, without going into too much detail, essentially have certain situations where we will need to persistently write to that specific variable. But otherwise, we still can control that variable. So we can pretty much write to anything. Some are a little bit more effort than others, but typically it's quite trivial. So that's process comprehension and manipulation. That's the first part of what we're going to talk about. So essentially, we can perform process comprehension at a distance There are multiple methods. The first two that I spoke about were basically unusable because they're not stealthy in the slightest bit. But when we actually start looking at bytecode read requests, we can actually combine the local variable block length and the 0-byte offsets to start identifying the library function blocks that we're looking at on the PLC. And then because we have precise access to the actual variables, we can start pulling out things like communications, credentials, all sorts of really interesting things that are going on. And then by flipping that the other way around, we can start writing to those variables as well. And we can also read and write to the local and the global variable block. So I've mentioned that there are a lot of variables in memory that just have 0 bytes that are completely inert. They don't do anything. They're never scanned by the PLC. They're never used. So they're our memory now. So we can use those for whatever we want, for storing our own data, or even transferring our own data. So depending on the OT network architecture, say for example we've delivered malware to a field site via a typical USB stick, for example, it might not be able to contact back to our command and control infrastructure because it doesn't have a specific connection to the internet from that field site. So anything trying to like exfiltrate data or trying to actuate that malware to actually do something that we want it to do might not be possible. So there's a very simplified diagram on screen. Assume it's some sort of distributed architecture, maybe water treatment, for example. And what we're saying is we've compromised the HMI on the field site, and we've also compromised the SCADA server in the cloud. And both that HMI and the SCADA server have legitimate reason to access the PLC highlighted in red in the top left of the diagram. So what we can do is we can use that dual-homed PLC as a proxy for command and control because we can just use its memory. So that unused memory is essentially used to relay traffic, both for the actual the C2 traffic itself and the data that we pass through over the C2 channel. Basically, how this works is we'll have typical client, say for example the SCADA server, and a client like the HMI, and the C2 server like the SCADA server. And they'll basically use the same method that I've mentioned before for enumerating the library function blocks. And they'll identify where in the local variable blocks that we have free memory. And then all we need is just 2 bytes. So as I said before, there'll typically be hundreds of bytes, but we only need 2. We need 1 byte for synchronization and control, and any additional bytes are just more bandwidth for us for our C2 channel. And the beauty of this is the only restrictions are what permissions we get when we compromise the client. So if we get admin permissions when we compromise the client, we can run commands at an admin level. Now this is going to be really difficult for me to, usually I pause this video, but I don't really have an option here. So I'm going to explain a little bit before I start. Hopefully it's visible as well. So this screen with just Windows command line is our client, our HMI in the scenario. And it's going to do ipconfig, and it's going to find that its IP address is 172.21.1.5. Got there before it moved. Now this is our attacker. This is, let's say, for example, the SCADA server. This is our C2 server. It can't ping the client. They don't have access to one another. But what it does have access to is a PLC. So we're going to start just enumerating one single function block. And this is what the tool looks like when it's running. It looks really ugly because we are all computer scientists that can't write nice-looking looking interfaces. And this goes through, and this is the part where I have to talk while it scans 300 bytes. And I'm just going to keep rambling on. So what's going to happen is it's going to say, hey, we've got to this specific length. This is probably this library function block. And for this case, it actually is unique. So it's going to suggest that it's modbus.com. But just for posterity, we'll say we'll do the offset pattern match, and we'll find that there. And then we'll choose to set up the C2 server from this. And then from the compromised client, obviously we have access to this. This would be automated in a real attack. We'll set up the C2 client. So once these sync up, It will ask us if we want to run a command, and we say, yes, please, we'd like to run a command. We run that from the server, and then the client will begin to receive it, and then eventually it will run it. And I think this is the only pop-in calc that's going to happen this conference, so I'm quite happy, unless someone else does. So yeah. Cool. So this is a kind of experimental piece. This is only something that we've conceived very recently. So it's limited, and also it's new. And this is the first time I've presented this, so if I stumble over my words, I'm very sorry. So why do we want to do lateral movement, and where are we doing it? So lateral movement is essentially moving laterally through the network. So you're not elevating your privileges, but you're going from device to device, for example. And we're doing this in level 1, so between PLCs, which is typically quite difficult to do. So this is something that we've been particularly excited about. So just to reiterate, we can ascertain which function blocks are running on a PLC. We can write to those function blocks, to the specific variables in each function block's local variable block. And typically those PLCs will have communication function blocks to talk to one another. And we can borrow those and work on the back of them. So this is quite out of date, so this is just the first thing that we played around with. So for the engineers that are laughing at this, yeah, I understand. But the get function block is intended to retrieve data from other PLCs over an S7 connection. And it has, the way it works is it has multiple pointers in the memory. So on the left screenshot, what you can see is that there are 4 addresses. And essentially, those 4 addresses point to another PLC, and they go grab from that specific piece of memory from another PLC and put it in a variable in our memory. And these are really often not fully configured. Typically, if one of these get function blocks is instantiated, only 1 or 2 of the pointers will actually be configured, and we can just configure the other ones. So what we can do is we can basically say, okay, so on the other PLC, pull out this piece of memory for us, please, and then just trigger the get function, and it will do it the next cycle. And we then just basically put something from the other PLC in our memory. Now, there's also a put function that does exactly the same thing, but opposite. So it puts things into the other memory of the PLC. Exactly the same thing. It has multiple addresses, typically not fully configured, so we can put something in the memory and then trigger it, and it'll go and do it for us. I thought I'd written more than that. So basically, the way this works is that we can use a put and get functions in unison to do the same technique that we just did for this PLC. It's a long-winded process, but what we can do is we can essentially use the get function to get every single byte of memory from the local variable block on the second PLC, and do the same thing through the one that we've already got access to. And then we can go further, and we can start writing into that PLC's memory with the put function as well. Now, we've not done anything particularly exciting with that. I've not come up with any demos, but it's something that I wanted to start talking about today. Maybe people have suggestions, so that would be really interesting to hear about at the end. But that's the latest thing that we're doing. So one of the things I mentioned was that the criteria included the requirement to be stealthy. And we wanted to test that. So we started to look at prevention and detection controls. So with prevention, we basically had firewalls between remote and local network segments. And we also had network monitoring for detection that was looking for any anomalous or malicious traffic. We had 9 use cases. I'm not going to read through all of them, but they're on screen, and they will be for the next couple of slides. And these were conducted in a sterile environment in an OT lab at Lancaster University. And yeah. So for prevention, again, firewalling, untrusted devices were mostly correctly prevented, which is great. It's not great for the ones that didn't. However, prevention between trusted devices largely failed. And that's kind of fine, because trusted devices between a firewall should be able to talk to one another. It's not fine because our devices in this network would be trusted. This is the whole point. This is the whole threat model of this attack. And what's worse is that many industrial firewalls aren't granular enough to actually start blocking read and write requests at specific memory levels between specific devices. They typically will only look at like high-level protocols, so S7COM in this situation. Next generation firewalls, more modern ones, they do go a little bit more granular. So the other commands that I mentioned very early on that were too noisy for us, so get block info and upload, you can block those, but we're not using those. For detection, we just used Clarity, CTD. Other vendors are available. We didn't have any preference. It was just that Clarity had set up in our lab at the time. And what Clarity does is it will basically make a baseline of the actual legitimate traffic, which we did. We baselined just the legitimate traffic. And then any deviations from that or any known malicious traffic will be detected. Standard attack tools, so in our T5S scenario, which was where we instructed the client over the C2 to do an Nmap scan, those kind of things are very obviously detected, that's fine. But the only problem is that draws a lot of attention. So we do have to be careful of what we're doing if we're using the C2. However, for the read and write requests, the main part of the attack, there were no alerts generated, just events, where it said baseline deviation, not risky change. And this happens frequently in these kind of softwares. So what does this actually mean for defense? Prevention, the techniques that we've described so far are intended to be used once you've actually breached the perimeter. So prevention and network segmentation and firewalls kind of not really the point here, and they're very difficult to actually prevent what we're talking about. And then it's not really feasible to put some sort of firewall with deep packet inspection in front of every PLC. And even if you did, it would be kind of dangerous to block specific read and writes to individual PLCs, because the configuration would have to be unbelievably precise. Otherwise, it's just going to start creating a risk. For detection, there was a little bit more of an opportunity for preventing or at least detecting this kind of attack, sorry. But the only problem is you'd have to basically alert on any weird read and write requests, which if you actually enable that kind of functionality, it's extremely noisy, and it's immediately going to cause alert fatigue, and it's quite hard to tune to actually be precise. So I think I've rattled through my slides really quickly. Yeah, so conclusion. I've only got 2 more slides. Quick recap. Most demos, science fiction. Not here today. I've actually been around because I was quite paranoid that I was going to say this. The demos here today are fantastic, but everyone knows that kind of marketing demo. This research brings those kind of attacks, however, closer to reality. I'll fully admit that there are limitations to doing this kind of thing, but it definitely brings it more closer to reality. So by utilizing these read and write requests, we can execute really high precision process comprehension and manipulation. And with creative use of those same techniques, we can circumvent best practice network segregation with the C2, and also eventually maybe look at lateral movement at level 1. And then finally, detection and prevention are extremely difficult, especially if you use the attack that we've described here today in the way it's intended, because it essentially just mimics normal traffic on the network. Now, I mentioned that we did a responsible disclosure, and it was like quite an adventure. And we had 3 typical responses from all of the vendors. And the first was just that, asset owners should implement certain security options, which was great. The security options were genuinely fantastic. So, for example, Siemens have block optimization, which squishes the memory together and it completely removes all of those 0 bytes in memory. However, any of these security options are invariably off by default. And if you do implement these security options, you just click a box, all of a sudden nothing talks to each other anymore because it's expecting the memory to be configured in a different way, and it's all of a sudden not predictable. So you basically then have to invest millions in completely changing everything in your environment to be able to talk to one another again. So it's kind of a very expensive option and a very expensive checkbox. The next one was segregate your devices. Good OT advice. Apart from the fact that any dual home PLCs completely break that now, because we can use that PLC as a C2 between the network segments. And then finally, the affected devices aren't our most recent models, and they weren't. I'm not going to say which devices they were, here at least, ask me later. However, every vendor that we actually looked at, this affected their most prolifically deployed and their best-selling device up to this day. And as everyone knows here, PLCs tend to be used in service for decades. So I don't think that we're going to see this kind of vulnerability, this systemic vulnerability, go away for the next decade or so. That's me. Thank you very much. 3 things on slide. The top one is the paper that I've just spoken about. It doesn't have the lateral movement, but it has everything else. The second one down is a OT ransomware technique that we presented at RSA last week. That's the preprint. It just got accepted at a journal called Digital Threats Research and Practice. And finally, Orange Cyberdefense's Security Navigator is the bottom thing. It's our annual report, and on page 107, I wrote some OT content, and you saw the kind of like weird wavy diagram at the start. That's one of the things that we talk about, this 35 years analysis of OT cyber attacks. But yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.